Good morning. My name is Denny Behr. I'm retired Navy. I'm a retired Command Master Chief. I was drafted in 1965, by the Army when Vietnam was really a mess. And I then enlisted in the Navy for 4 years. I was a sub-hunter. It was during the Russian Cold War. My story is going to be just one flight and one day out in the Mediterranean aboard the USS Wasp, where my squadron flew off from to chase Russian submarines. And so it was southern Minnesota. I was born and raised on a farm out in southern Minnesota. We actually lived on 5 different farms, but by the time I graduated from high school, I went on to 2-year technical school in electronics, and I had no idea how that would affect me later in life, but I always found it interesting with the draft going on. I was deferred as long as I got good grades, but back in the 60s, everything was, no emails, everything was postal mail. But my draft notice almost beat me home when my diploma arrived. So just as soon as I graduated, I got drafted. So I enlisted in the Navy. That's a whole story in itself, but I'll stay focused on this one particular chapter. Boot camp at Great Lakes. Boot camp was not that hard for me because my dad was a kind of a disciplinarian and hardworking, and we worked hard. We got up early. It was just kind of like boot camp every day on the farm, and that served me well. My mother was a wonderful woman, a good Norwegian, loving, nurturing woman, and that served me well too throughout my whole life. So I had a good foundation from that little farm, and I made it through boot camp, and I was young, naive, watched too many John Wayne movies. I wanted to go to Vietnam, and I've always wanted to fly. My life was full of tractors on the ground and cornfields, and I wanted to fly, and I said I want to be a helicopter door gunner. So pretty short lifespan during Vietnam. But that was my silly, young, enthusiastic attitude. So they started poking tests at me, and apparently I scored pretty high in areas of technology and whatnot. And the chief said, you're going to fly all right, but you're not going to be over the rice paddies. You're going to be chasing Russian submarines over the water. We're going to send you to all kinds of schools if we can get a top secret clearance. So he said, this was kind of like a job interview, or you would call it pre-counseling for selecting your career in college. So he said, but before we're going to spend all this money on you, the Navy is going to make you a anti-submarine warfare sub-chaser. We need to know, you have any trouble with drugs? I mean, I was so naive. I'm like, drugs? Well, you go to the Walgreens drugstore and buy aspirin. What are you talking about? Okay, have any trouble with the cops? Cops? And he kept pinging on me. Anything, because you'll never get this clearance if you have any trouble. I said, Chief, oh, I know. He said, not even a parking ticket? I said, Chief, I drove the tractor into town. And he just howled. He said, okay, I got a good naive farm boy here with a solid foundation. And I'm telling you, the Navy sent me to so many schools, from oceanography and how the submarines are propelled in the water to electronics. And I finally got orders to Patrol Squadron 31, VS-31. You can see the patch here where we're up in the air flying and chasing that Russian submarine, which is the figure on the patch that represents the Russian submarine. Well, about 18 or 19 months after I joined the Navy, to show you how fast things move, they had trained me as an anti-submarine warfare technician to operate all that equipment in that S-2 aircraft. And that aircraft had 4 people in it. It was about as big as a Volkswagen Beetle, very crowded, just 4 people in it. The 2 officers up front, 2 enlisted at back. And I was a senior enlisted, senior because I was 21 years old. I had a 17-year-old beside me and an 18-year-old beside me. One of them is no longer with us. But anyway, that's the airplane they taught us inside out, and that held all the electronics, and we flew off this carrier. So this one particular flight, I want to say that I went in approximately 18 months from driving a John Deere tractor cultivating corn out in the fields of southern Minnesota to being catapulted off of this ship, off this carrier, the USS Wasp, in the Mediterranean Ocean in hot pursuit of a Russian submarine. So that's a lot of change and a lot of learning, a lot of classes in 18 months. The Cold War, and this is the Russian Cold War, because right now we got North Korea Cold War on our hands, and we still got the Russians coming up again with the Cyber Cold War. I follow this stuff very closely, and we got the China Cold War. But the Cold War back then was Ivan. That was the Russians. And they had a huge submarine fleet. Their submarines were starting to become more sophisticated and more lethal than ours. The Cold War, for us, hunting submarines from that aircraft, that S-2 it's called, made by Grumman, it was called a Hunter Tracker Killer. That aircraft is designed specifically to hunt Russian submarines off of aircraft carriers. And there were several squadrons like that in several aircraft carriers that were trying to chase and track the Russian subs. To show you how, if the Cold War would have ever got hot and gone nuclear, none of us would be here today. It's the lethal power of a Russian submarines or one of ours is absolutely unimaginable. 16 guided missiles, ICBMs, that could be launched from under the water, so you don't know where they're at. They're not like a land missile. You don't know, and then you don't know when they're coming from, and then that missile had multiple warheads on it. So once it's launched, and each one of those warheads, think of it as a GPS, was locked on a city. Madison was not one of the targets. Chicago was. Big city. So every major city had crosshairs on it for a nuclear weapon. And as that sub was maneuvering, those things were adjusting for that latitude and longitude. And these were nuclear weapons. So that's one submarine, and that's one example of the lethal potentiality of the Cold War. And the whole Cold War was us, the United States, trying to prove to them, Russia, that we knew where they were. With the push of a button, we could drop a torpedo or a mine from our aircraft, and we could destroy the submarine. Now, we never did that because the Cold War never went hot, but that was our role, and we pushed each other right to the brink. It was Tom Clancy and Hunt for Red October day in and day out. And it was an incredible experience as a young farm boy. I look back at it now, and the reason is very troubling, and because of war, and the reason is very morbid. But if you take the philosophical out of it and just look at the adrenaline flow and the flying off of carriers and what we did, it was a very incredible experience. The one particular flight and chapter I want to share with you happened in the Mediterranean, and we were really hot on this one particular Russian sub. We'd track him for a few hours, and then we'd lose her, and she'd go deep, and then we'd track him some more, and cat and mouse, round the clock, cat and mouse. And it started bothering the Russians bad enough that they asked to bring in harassments to us, so they brought in Russian aircraft. And they started flying through our flight pattern, which is totally illegal against the International Geneva Convention. Here's an aircraft carrier launching aircrafts, and they came right through perpendicular with this massive Russian aircraft, 4-engine turboprop, huge airplane, which belongs up at probably 20,000 feet, not at 200 feet. So this particular day, we can't believe our eyes. Don Riggert and I were pre-flighting our plane. We're going to get launched, and this thing comes lumbering across, and we had to stop flight ops, and the aircraft carrier had to change directions and cause total chaos. And of course, this is when you hear on the news, we filed Geneva Convention, they broke all that. And so there's a lot of diplomacy flying around. But that was all done with red phones and HF radios. We didn't have the technology we had. We're in the Mediterranean. They got to bounce signals with high frequencies. Very different world back in the 60s from a technology standpoint. So anyway, here he comes around again. This happens about 3 times now. On any given day in the Med, the sun is shining over there, and a squall is over there, and a thunderstorm is happening there. You see it off in the distance. So there was a squall off the port side, probably at 11 o'clock. And here he comes again, and we don't know what to do. We're talking to the diplomats. The captain is, not us. And they're trying to figure out, how we're going to get this Russian bomber, huge airplane, to stop harassing us, because we're in international waters and what we're doing is strictly legal. So he come around, and he's way too low, and he goes about 11 o'clock, and he goes through this little squall. And there was just enough downdraft in that squall, pushed him down. His port wing, his left wing tip hit the ocean, and he cartwheeled, and this aircraft held many people. I don't know, probably 20-some people. And this aircraft disintegrated in front of us, bodies flying through the air. And so many things took place right then. Number one, you can imagine the commanding officer, what was going through his mind. Here it is. The Cold War is going hot right here on my flight, my watch. The Russians think that we manipulated this aircraft or shot him down or forced him down. And they're going to retaliate. And so you can only imagine what the red phone back to the Pentagon was like. And so that was all happening. At the same time, and just a young lad of 21, maybe I was 22, I'd have to do the math. The old chief hollers out on the 1MC, that's a loudspeaker, all cameras will be thrown overboard. And that was back in the day, you had these big 35 millimeters, and because this whole thing was going to stay under the radar and never hit the public eye. I did see him, a couple people thought they could sneak a picture of Russian dead bodies and stuff, and he just grabbed the camera, ripped it right off, threw it right in the ocean. So none of this was ever really recorded or never came back to the States. But then we immediately, and all this was happening simultaneously, our helicopters that normally go alongside our ship to pick us up if we crash, they diverted over there, half a mile and started picking up Russian bodies. We had jumpers going in, U.S. Navy jumpers, and grabbing body parts and stuff. And then we launched our small boats, our rescue boats. So we went from trying to sink Ivan and kill him in the time of Cold War, or prove to him that we could kill him. That's what Cold War is about. And now we're in a humanitarian effort. It's just, I didn't know what to make of it all. And we respect the enemy, and he's dead, and we're picking up bodies and bringing body parts and bodies. We never did find them all, because the plane just disintegrated and sunk. But so I took away from that, the older I get those pictures in my mind, I don't know if I can put it in words about how humanity is still more powerful than war. Because there we went from the adrenaline pumping, we got this submarine right where we want, and then this enemy aircraft, all these lives are lost right in front of us. And now we have sympathy and we're trying to help. as time went on, it wasn't long, there was a Russian ship there, and we brought Russians aboard. There was interpreters, there was diplomats. They took their dead, like I was, they were air crewmen. They took their dead air crewmen and body parts, and I don't know what was said. I obviously wasn't part of that negotiation. But the good news is, World War III did not start on that flight. And I can't help but reflect also, if that's one flight in one instance, and there was these squadrons and aircraft carriers all over and these submarines in other oceans, it's nothing short of a miracle that the Cold War never turned into a nuclear holocaust. Because all it takes is a bad judgment, operational error, a mistake, we're all humans, equipment failure, or a series of that, and it could have just escalated because we had the nuclear arsenals just on our submarines and their submarines to blow both nations right off the face of the earth. So I guess in closing, I can say, if there's such a thing as a successful war, and there isn't, because all wars are a sin, and that's why we have wars, because we live in a broken world. But if there is such a thing as a successful war, it was a Cold War. And that's why it's not followed. You don't see big layouts in museums about it, because there was not enough blood and guts. There was not enough thing for the mainstream media. I mean, if it bleeds, it leads. That's their code of ethics. That's what they follow. And there wasn't a lot of that going on. It was highly technical, highly dangerous, very sophisticated, and very high priced. And now that just that Russian Cold War is over, there's other Cold Wars going on. But I leave you with this thought. The reason we won, because the wall came down in Berlin, that was a big milestone that we finally crushed Russia. And what we crushed was their economy. We crushed the nation, because now that I'm older and look back at it, it was democracy feeding a free enterprise system, feeding our war machine. This technology I described is very, very high priced. And then the enemy, the Russians, communism, trying to muster up enough money to feed their war machine, to keep it, at the same par as ours, and they couldn't do it. So we basically crushed them with technological advances and proved to them that we could wipe them out. And in my mind, that was a Cold War victory for the Russian Cold War. So in closing, I want to thank you for viewing and listening to merely one day and one flight and one instance in the Cold War in the 1960s. So Master Chief Denny Behr signing off. Thank you.